world is becoming more protectionist. You don't need to own every part of the supply chain. You need to own the commanding heights. If India was wise, it would choose to build universities rather than chip factories.
If you were a betting man, would you put your money on India leveraging its youth boom?
India is actually trying to do exactly the same thing the US has to do, create jobs for the missing middle.
Hello, and welcome to The Call. I'm your host, Jay Sapsford, and here's today's question of the moment. Can India turn youth into wealth? Demographic waves can fuel economic miracles. China did this by leveraging a surge in young workers to drive transformational growth. Now it's India's turn. Its workforce is growing. By 2030, 1 in 5 working-age people on God's green earth will be Indian. So will India follow China and leverage its youth dividend? Many of India's young workers are unemployed, especially women. Our guest today warns that India is leaving a lot of money on the table and needs significant reforms to unlock its youth potential. Joining us now is Raghuram Rajan, former governor of the Reserve Bank of India, former IMF chief economist, and professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and he is also the co-author of Breaking the Mold, a book using frank analysis and pithy examples to chart India's path towards prosperity. Raghu, welcome to The Call.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start with the trade talks between India and the United States. The word is a deal could be coming soon. Is there some sort of a first mover advantage for India here? Is there some opportunity being one of the first countries out of the gate to cut a deal with Washington?
Possibly. I mean, it does send a signal about the strength of US-India ties under this administration. And to that extent, I think it could make India a more attractive place for firms to locate in. I think India's big advantage is it has a very sizable domestic economy. It's in the next few years, maybe 2 or 3, it's going to overtake both Japan and Germany in the size of that economy, even at market exchange rates. And so when you locate in India, you have the benefit of, the safety of a local market you can produce for, as well as potentially exports. And the first is actually very important in this world of ever-changing alliances. You don't want to put something on the ground and then find there's no market for it. So to my mind, that it does offer an opportunity for India to signal that it's open and also, in a sense, point to its own domestic market.
So India is the most populous country. It's also the world's largest democracy, and its economy is growing at 7%. But is it growing fast enough to create enough jobs for its population?
Not really. So 6 to 7 sounds fantastic, and that's probably where it will be this year, despite the trade disruptions. But the reality is you need to compare India not with other large, prosperous economies or even China, which is really a middle-income economy, but with other economies at India's per capita level of GDP. And then when you compare with Korea at India's stage or China at India's stage, you see that India is probably below them, maybe by a couple of percentage points. And so to really employ all the youth to get the full advantage of what is sometimes called the population dividend, India really needs to up its growth by a couple of percentage points at least.
Now, China succeeded in moving workers from the fields to the factories. Can India mimic that success?
Much harder today, and for 3 real reasons, which I think are also important for the US as it considers moving workers back into manufacturing. The first is technology. Manufacturing has become much more automated. The idea that people still screw things into cell phones really is a very small part of what's going on. It's machine after machine assembling the cell phone, even in India. And so that's one. Technology has automated much of what was labor-intensive work earlier. Second, I think that the world is becoming more protectionist. Everybody wants to bring manufacturing back home, and so the market is not as big. There's not as much room for a new China, and India's China's size, as you noted earlier. The third, I think, is really that China and Vietnam and other sort of emerging markets have pushed down wages and profits in these areas tremendously. So the idea that you'd bring labor arbitrage to the table, you'd be competing with rich country workers Not true anymore. You're competing with other emerging market workers, and there's not that much money on the table.
I'm interested in this notion. One of our members is asking right now, and the same question I had, can India skip manufacturing and go straight to services?
Well, first, I don't think it should pick a sector and say we want to do services or manufacturing. But it should do its best in manufacturing, make it attractive for people to come in and do stuff. But what it needs to realize is that you don't necessarily need to go through manufacturing. Though, of course, that's the success story of East Asia and China. India's created jobs over the last 40 years, primarily in services rather than in manufacturing. And typically, and we're not talking about software services, which is a well-known success for India, but we're talking about things like financial services. We're talking about even repair or plumbing or carpentry, all the stuff that urban households need. Those also create jobs. And given India's large population, there are lots of jobs of that variety also available. So India can create jobs for the moderately skilled by upskilling its workforce to do these kinds of daily activities that people need. But it can also take the high end, which is what it's been doing in recent years with high skill services. That is your consultant working from Bangalore with a multinational operating across the world, or your financial services expert working from Hyderabad and working for JP Morgan. Many banks have enormous workforces in India, not just doing the software, but also doing some of the financial services for the rest of the world.
Now, in your book, you talk about the smile curve, and it gets at this question about the high end versus low end. And you talk about the example of Apple, who does a lot of work on the beginning of the supply chain with R&D and planning and design, and at the very end of the supply chain where it's marketing and branding. But in the middle, a lot of that work is outsourced to companies like Foxconn. You make the point that Apple is got a market cap of 3 trillion, or it's measured in the trillions of dollars, whereas Foxconn is about 50 billion. What is the takeaway for India as it plans its future?
Well, I think it's precisely that the value added in many supply chains isn't in the manufacturing part. It's in the design, the intellectual property, and the upselling, the finance, the marketing, etc., which makes that product a real brand. So, when it looks at all that and recognizes that Apple doesn't need to do manufacturing to be able to do the design, NVIDIA doesn't need to make chips in order to design them. You don't need to own every part of the supply chain. You need to own the commanding heights, so to speak, of the supply chain. So India already does chip design. It has a whole bunch of engineers working for Qualcomm, for Broadcom, doing chip design. It doesn't do any chip manufacturing, but chip manufacturing is extremely costly, as we've discovered in this country. You need billions and billions of dollars in subsidies. So if India was wise, it would choose to build universities rather than chip factories. Universities to produce the chip designers who occupy that part of the supply chain rather than the low end of the supply chain.
I wonder if you could tell us about the India Stack. To me, this strikes me as one of the most successful examples of industrial policy the world has ever seen. You've given a digital identity to hundreds of millions of Indian citizens. It allows them to transfer from bank account to bank account, and in some cases, what we in the United States call the unbanked are also able to make transactions so that every stall owner with a cell phone can participate in the economy. Isn't this an example of sort of top-down? Sort of a direction that's given from the center to the people that has been a success for India and has really sparked a lot of innovation.
Right. What's important to recognize is the government, directed by Nandan Nilekani, a very successful entrepreneur in his own right, uh, created a structure where the government filled in the pieces that only the government could. For example, created a national ID and actually implemented it. But left the private sector to take the parts that were much more private sector sort of related. So it created the framework, the basis, and then said, look, this is available. Why don't you create the apps that can live on this platform? For example, one of the most successful applications is what is called UPI, Universal Payment Interface, where
Right.
a vendor can accept payments directly into his bank account from somebody who wants to buy. And this is, when I last checked, the transactions on this monthly were 11 billion transactions a month. So it's been successful. What I think was very important was to create a platform on which the private sector could compete.
Hmm.
UPI was initiated in my time at the RBI, and my only decision was to say, look, let the non-banks also come in so that there is competition, because the banks left to their own devices would have killed the competition. And what we see today is some of the biggest players on this platform are non-banks like Google Pay and Walmart's application, which is PhonePe. So I think that this is actually very, very effective.
Well, no, I have another audience member question here that sort of tees off the success of the India stack and says, how does that compare? What is your assessment of the production-linked incentive (PLI) schemes? Do they work? Now, I'd like to. It's interesting that in the case of the payment system, we've had this stunning success, but my understanding from your book is that you're a little critical of the PLI.
Well, again, so this goes back to where industrial policy is most effective. I think it's effective if it creates the framework and eliminates the hassle of coming in, makes doing business easier, and then let's private business take over and compete on a level playing field, both foreign investors as well as domestic. The worry I have about PLI is instead of creating the framework and saying, look, let's make doing business in India easier. And certainly there are efforts by the government to do that. There's a splendid improvement in infrastructure, but there's still, irritations. The tax authorities will come in periodically without warning and so on. So we need to work on those and make it much easier to acquire land, much easier to know what policy is going to be. But sometimes when we see that, we say, oh, the easy way out is let's subsidize and offer subsidies for this or for that. And the reality is, then you're intervening much more in the economy. You're picking the sectors you think will win, and you're putting enormous subsidies into that. To my mind, that's problematic, first, because bureaucrats don't know which sectors will win. There's a lot of lobbying to get those sectors in, and also lobbying for the kind of subsidies. But also, I think in the longer run, that money is better spent creating the infrastructure, creating the universities, creating the workforce, and the upskilling that businesses would benefit by. So I am skeptical about the size of the subsidies. I think creating a bit better business environment is really what the government should be about.
Well, speaking of the business environment, do regional security dynamics, another reader asked, or another audience member asked, affect India's economic outlook? And might India benefit geopolitically from closer ties to the United States?
I think the answer to the second part is yes. I do think that there is an opportunity here to build ties between the two countries, extending over a variety of areas, including trade, but also people-to-people transfers and also the defense. Right now, they cooperate within what is called the Quad, and certainly there's been a fair amount of cooperation, and India will certainly ramp up its defense purchases from the United States. But I think what is important also is that India maintain reasonable ties with its neighbors so that it creates a much more vibrant South Asia. And unfortunately, the events of the last few days with the terrorist attack on tourists in Kashmir and the reaction on both sides of the border has been unfortunate. To my mind, certainly India, taking into account the anger in its citizenry, should be attempting also to calm down the situation, while targeting any kinds of measures on based on evidence of who the perpetrators might be, rather than a blanket let's escalate within the region.
Well, our condolences are with those who lost their loved ones in those incidents. I wanted to make a comparison. Another one of our audience members is asking a question that I've seen written about before. How would you compare India's economic growth and youth employment potential to that of Brazil?
Oh, that's a tough question. Look, I think there are many similarities between India and Brazil. Brazil, of course, is a richer middle income country than India is. But I think if you take the creme de la creme of Indian youth, I mean, they're on par with anybody from anywhere else in the world. And of course, there are a lot more of them because our population is high, and many of them have gone to from high school to graduate degrees. India's number of graduates in education is actually very high for a country of its level of income. That said, India, like Brazil, needs to up the quality of its colleges and its universities so that more of those who are being trained have a higher quality education. One big difference between India and Brazil, one of the limitations over time has been the limited amount of investment that Brazil, like many other Latin American economies, has done in its own economy. India is younger and therefore is investing more in infrastructure. We'll get to Brazil's level of infrastructure at some point, but hopefully, with the benefit of hindsight, improve the technological sort of capacity of that infrastructure, make it much more wedded to the kinds of new technologies that are coming in.
Well, you have advocated for more investment in human capital, everything from education to health security in your book. I also wonder, another reader, actually, or another audience member is asking, how much of a drag on India is corruption?
Look, let me not minimize corruption. It exists in every emerging market. India is no exception. That said, do you have to pay a bribe to get in? No, I think while the FCPA was strictly enforced, American firms could come in. And I've talked to business people who say, look, the point is when they know you can't pay a bribe, they basically say, look, I'm not going to go out of my way to do things for you. But many state governments are competing with each other for business. The state of Tamil Nadu, which I work with, has an entire organization called Guidance, which actually works with foreign investors to bring them in. And that kind of government effort can actually overcome any sort of impetus from the bureaucracy to demand bribes and so on. It can actually remove many of the hurdles. So on the one hand, if you say I can't pay bribes, they know they can't demand them. On the other hand, you have these vehicles by which everything is smoothed out because the chief minister of the state knows that if he brings in more investment, more jobs, his re-election is more secure. So you have the competing state bureaucracies, which also help make it easier to set up. Down the road, when they know you don't pay bribes, they don't come and ask. I mean, that's part of having a rigid rule which says, look, I can't do it.
We anticipated this next question. It comes in, it taps your expertise, not as an India expert, but as a former central banker. Will Jerome Powell lose his job before the end of his term?
I don't see how the administration benefits from that. I think it's very useful to have a scapegoat. We told Jerome Powell to reduce interest rates, and he stuck it out. He didn't. And that's why we have a downturn, whatever the extent of the downturn. I think, therefore, I mean, of course, it's very hard to know the mind of the leadership in this administration fully. But I think if they were sensible about it, they would just keep complaining about higher interest rates. And eventually, if there is a serious downturn, the Fed will reduce interest rates, and then you can say, oh, they reduced it too late. That's why the downturn is really severe. But I don't see why you want to, and it doesn't solve anything from the administration's perspective, because unless you essentially get rid of the entire FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, you don't solve anything by just taking out power from the top.
Spoken like a true central banker. Raghu, if you were a betting man, would you put your money on India leveraging its youth boom?
Look, I am biased. I hope India actually succeeds. I do think that, India is actually trying to do exactly the same thing the US has to do, which is create jobs which are secure, good jobs for the missing middle, the people who are moderately educated, moderately skilled, but want a much more reasonable life. And I think across the world we're looking for that. India needs to do that, and that requires really very very savvy decision making. And my sense is, my hope is we do that. I think it does, as I said, require strong leadership.
All right, we'll all be watching to see whether or not India can achieve that vision. Our audience now has had their morning shot of informational espresso and is ready to tackle the day. Raghuram Rajan, professor of finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Missed a live episode? Catch the replay on our website, LinkedIn, or on YouTube. And you can also listen to the call's podcast edition on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to our members for joining us today. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.